In a mass show of support for the pro-democracy protest movement as it enters its 7th month, hundreds of thousands cram into Hong Kong streets to cries as "Fight for freedom" and "Stand with Hong Kong." At least 43 people die in a devastating fire at a handbag factory in New Delhi. Workers were awoken by the blaze in the early hours and then trapped inside the burning building. Its owner has been detained. And in the face of massive strike action that's set to worsen in the coming days, France's Prime Minister holds meetings over his government's redesign of the national retirement system. Meanwhile, transport remains at a standstill. Thank you for joining us in the France 24 newsroom. I'm Nadia Sharbi. In a forceful display of support for Hong Kong's 6-month-long pro-democracy protests, some 800,000 people are thought to have taken part in the largest mass rally in months this Sunday. 2 weeks after pro-establishment parties got a thrashing in local elections, a leading activist warned the city's leaders they had a last chance to end the political crisis. Erin Ongunki explains.
6 months after the start of pro-democracy demonstrations in Hong Kong, the movement shows no signs of slowing. Quite the contrary. Sunday's rally drew some of the largest crowds in months, with organizers estimating some 800,000 people took part. Even by nightfall, tens of thousands of torchlights lit up the city, bouncing off high-rise buildings and winding through narrow side streets. Earlier Sunday, one demonstrator used performance art to transmit the message, crawling on her hands and feet to symbolize the difficulties protesters face.
I think the difficulty for Hong Kongers is not just about what kind of method we are using or what means, but it's that this is really a long-term struggle that we have to persist.
Organizers hailed the high turnout for Sunday's march, adding they hoped it would push the government to make more concessions.
And for Hong Kong people, we hope this will be a signature for our movement after 6 months to show, to carry them, as well as to the world, that people are not giving up. People will still fight for our freedom and democracy.
The controversial extradition bill, which sparked the demonstrations, has now been dropped. But protester demands have broadened. Many held up 5 fingers to represent their 5 key demands, including granting amnesty to arrested protesters, an independent probe into police violence, and universal suffrage.
Further dimming prospects for a resumption of denuclearization talks, North Korea has announced that it carried out a very important but unspecified test on Saturday. The test took place at a long-range rocket launch site that Pyongyang had partially dismantled after entering talks with the US last year. And reacting on Twitter, Donald Trump warned that his counterpart Kim Jong-un had everything to lose through hostility towards Washington. Gemina Dilek reports.
It seems like this one in North Korea that many dread and could well happen again, as North Korean media announced that the country has successfully conducted what it described as an important test at the Sohae missile launch base, most likely a ground-based engine test rather than another launch. The test comes as North Korea tries to pressure the US to make sanctions concessions by its 31st of December deadline. Relations on the peninsula were already at a low, and Seoul was worried. Earlier in the day, US President Donald Trump and South Korean President Moon Jae-in had a half-hour phone call to discuss North Korean relations.
The two leaders agreed that the current situation on the Korean peninsula has become severe and that dialogues should continue to achieve prompt results from denuclearization negotiations between North Korea and the United States.
South Korea and the US have agreed to hold summit talks. Ahead of the test, Trump wanted to continue dialogue with Pyongyang and struck a positive note on his relationship with Kim Jong-un.
I'd be surprised if North Korea acted hostilely. I have a very good relationship with Kim Jong-un. I think we both want to keep it that way.
The question now is whether renewed testing will be a game changer for Trump, who has in the past minimized North Korea's provocations.
Tearful relatives of the victims of this Sunday's deadly fire in New Delhi say they received desperate calls in the early hours as factory workers pleaded to be freed from the inferno that was engulfing their building. At least 43 people are confirmed killed in the blaze that broke out overnight, catching many in their sleep. Taking to Twitter, Prime Minister Narendra Modi described the situation as extremely horrific. The owner of the building has been detained on suspicion of culpable homicide, not amounting to murder. Our New Delhi correspondent Mandakini Galat tells us more.
An extremely tragic incident there that highlights yet again the lax enforcement of fire safety regulations in workshops in the Indian capital and indeed across the country. Now, the fire broke out in the early hours of this morning in a 4-story residential building, which, like many others in this area, housed illegally set up factories to manufacture, in this case, paper products and cardboard, and employed laborers largely from the neighboring states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. Now, at least 50 such laborers were believed to be sleeping inside the workshop. The cramped rooms and the narrow doorways of the building acted as a death trap once the fire started, and people panicked in an attempt to escape. Now, fire service officials trying to put out the fire and access the inner rooms were hampered by the dark and poorly lit interiors. Now, there have been visuals on our television screens all morning that show fire officials carrying bodies out into the narrow lanes, which are really too narrow even for the fire trucks or even ambulances to enter. So very tragic. Both the Prime Minister and the city's Chief Minister have expressed regret and announced compensation packages for the families of the deceased. An inquiry has been instituted, the results of which will be out in the next 7 days. The death toll, as you said, stands at 43, with scores of others with very critical injuries.
A budget of resistance aimed at countering the effects of US sanctions targeting Iran's vital oil sector. That's how President Hassan Rouhani presented a $36 billion package to Parliament this Sunday. The budget, set to benefit from a yet-to-be-finalised $5 billion investment from Russia, comes in the wake of brutally repressed demonstrations sparked by a shock fuel price hike last month. Here's a clip of Rouhani's comments this Saturday.
We know that under the current situation, people are feeling the pressure of sanctions. We know people's purchasing power has declined. Next year, as was the case this year, our budget will be one of resistance and perseverance against sanctions. This budget announces to the world that despite sanctions, we will manage the country, especially in terms of its oil.
Finland is set to get its youngest ever Prime Minister next week. This after the Social Democrats, who lead the five-party coalition government, picked 34-year-old Transportation Minister Sanna Marin as successor to the Premier, who resigned earlier this week. Now, here in France, an open-ended strike over the government's plans to reform the pension system continues to play out. And amid warnings of even worse gridlock to come in the coming days, this Sunday, Prime Minister Édouard Philippe has been holding special meetings with government ministers involved in the reform before meeting with the president himself. Meanwhile, the tug-of-war over public support is also ongoing. Opinion polls show most French citizens believe that reform is necessary, but also that they support the protests. Irina Gunki and our colleagues at France 3 have more.
In one of the country's biggest general strikes in decades, more than 800,000 people flooded streets across France to protest planned pension reforms. The majority of French citizens support the mass demonstrations, as they did in 1995, when similar protests paralyzed the country for 3 weeks, eventually forcing then Prime Minister Alain Juppé to scrap his government's pension reform plan. But public opinion is not necessarily the deciding factor for ending political stalemates.
Sometimes, even in the face of protests with vast popular support, the government won't budge an inch. In other cases, the government is ceded to protesters' demands, even when they didn't have much popular support, because they successfully paralyzed the country. That was the case in 1995.
Political communication also plays an essential role. Former and current Prime Ministers Alain Juppé and Édouard Philippe adopted two opposing strategies.
Yes, France can and must continue on the path towards reform, which has been avoided for much too long. That is my deep conviction.
My logic is not and will never be that of confrontation.
Today, perhaps even more so than in 1995, the government must take a widespread sense of economic injustice into account.
In 1995, like in 2019, the government was extremely unpopular. And now, 25 years later, the same concerns about retirement remain. But there's also a pervasive sense of suffering in the country, especially as it relates to purchasing power.
On Sunday, the French Prime Minister said he would not cave to pressure from the streets, insisting if his government is unable to move forward with pension reform now, much more brutal changes could be required in the future. The government is set to reveal the details of the controversial plan on Wednesday.
Several thousand rallied this Sunday in Kiev to call on President Volodymyr Zelensky to defend the country's interests at this week's summit with Russia, Germany and France on ending the war in Ukraine's east. Many demonstrators fear that political novice Zelensky could be outmaneuvered by his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin during Monday's gathering in Paris. Our correspondent Gulliver Cragg has more.
The main message of this demonstration is that there are red lines that President Zelensky must not cross during his meeting with Vladimir Putin in Paris. He must not agree to give up on any Ukrainian territory, say the demonstrators. Also, he must not agree to hold elections in the occupied parts of Donbass while Russian-backed armed separatist forces are still there. And also, he must not cede any ground on Ukraine's ambitions to join the European Union and NATO.
I don't trust him. From what he's done so far, he never sticks to one line. He promises one thing and does something completely different, the opposite even.
We came today to support him so that he would not make mistakes that could be fatal for Ukraine. We don't want war, but we don't want to give up on our interests.
It's a demonstration of support to help the Ukrainian president avoid missteps. If there are missteps, then it could turn into a protest. But for today, it's about making sure Zelensky doesn't cross those red lines.
For his part, Volodymyr Zelensky has said that he will not cross those red lines. But he's not exactly heading into these negotiations with Vladimir Putin in a position of strength. The ongoing impeachment proceedings against Donald Trump in Washington have cast a shadow of doubt over American support for Ukraine, which has been so crucial to this country in its standoff with the Russians. And also, the host of the meeting in Paris, French President Emmanuel Macron, has made it clear that he wants to improve his relations with Vladimir Putin, something that has got a lot of Ukrainians very worried indeed.
Australian firefighters are racing to contain more than 140 blazes ahead of a heatwave forecast for early this week. Smoke haze from the bushfires spread to the capital Canberra on Sunday, with experts explaining that the country's fire season began earlier and is more extreme this year due to a prolonged drought and the effects of climate change. Sam Bradpeace reports.
Facing the inferno, these firemen had no other choice but to flee.
We're putting out a spot fire, the next minute there's a 30-metre flame behind us. I mean, you just can't keep up.
More than 100 fires burned across eastern Australia on Saturday. High temperatures and strong winds caused 8 separate blazes to combine into this so-called mega fire north of Sydney. After it burned through more than 250,000 hectares within 1 hour's drive of Australia's largest city, the fire was too much even for the jets to control, and some had their homes destroyed.
Well, it's like someone ripping your heart off, eh? That's how you feel at the moment, but what you do, that's life.
Sydney itself was clouded in smoke. A 3-month drought has left much of eastern Australia like a tinderbox.
We've also seen the fires come into very close proximity to major population centres, whether it's on the south coast, the central coast, or even Greater Western Sydney.
More than 600 homes have been destroyed and 6 people have died since the crisis began in September. While the mega fire is under control for now, a heatwave expected next week could bring further problems.
And on that, we leave this edition. Stay tuned to France 24. There's more coming up.